So welcome, Leonhard Weese from Hong Kong. How are you today?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, following your Instagram, sorry, your Twitter account, is really close to the source. So the hashtag stand by with Hong Kong. Can you introduce yourself for those who don't follow you, who don't know you?
I'm Leo. I've been based in Hong Kong for the past 8 years, where we started the Bitcoin meetup in 2012, which has grown into the Bitcoin Association, which is a relatively vibrant and colorful mix of people that are all having building their businesses on Bitcoin or developing on it, or are simply enthusiasts or developers, traders. If you've come through Hong Kong in the past few years, you've probably come through some of our meetups, events, conferences, hackathons.
Yeah, awesome. So, of course, for anyone who is deeply into Bitcoin, it's absolutely clear that Bitcoin is a form of protest, if not the best form of protest. But let's talk first about what's going on right now. I think it's over 6 months now that the protest there started. Can you give your perspective? Because of course, for people outside of Hong Kong, they just know the media, what the media shows them, or what they can maybe see from an insider's
Yeah,
perspective.
yeah. For the past few years, maybe even since the handover in 1997, when China, as they call it, resumed sovereignty over Hong Kong, people have been fearing that their rights and their freedoms and their ability to do business in the city are slowly eroded. People fear that they are not able to participate in local governance, that local governance and the economy is increasingly rigged against them, that they're being exploited by people far away in Beijing that rule over a formerly communist country. And in the past few years, these protests have they've been showing up in different forms. People have been protesting different things. People have been protesting to opening up TV licenses, but people have also been protesting against national education, sort of patriotic school subjects. Currently, people are protesting primarily for against police brutality and for universal suffrage. The protests started half a year ago when people were still mainly opposing an extradition law that people feared could be used to, pretty much pick up anybody on the streets of Hong Kong legally by the police and send them to China, where they would disappear into camps simply for having publicly opposed the legitimacy of the Communist Party in China. The law has been withdrawn, but in that protest, the government has shown that they can be quite fierce and quite brutal in their way of actively suppressing dissent. And so this movement grew into, openly opposing the police, openly opposing state violence. And the further and further it goes, of course, the more it is about the fifth demand about genuine universal suffrage, because people believe that such horrific acts, if they've seen it numerous times now on the streets, can only be really be prevented if their head of government are democratically elected and are held accountable in elections.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Do you think the police brutality big a big part of why it's being so brutal is the psychological factor, the psychological warfare, basically?
I think the police and the state have been caught very much by surprise by this, meaning they haven't really come out with coherent strategies or coherent ideas of how to properly suppress people. So I don't think there are as many, organized efforts to, kind of conduct some kind of psychological warfare in people. What is happening? What uh, is that the government is unable to really meet any of these demands because they consider their rule and their unquestioned authority to be pretty much their bottom line. And so they've very much been using tools like terrifying their subjects, giving them the impression that they're powerless and can, pretty much only be subdued with fear. And I think a lot of us would call this psychological warfare, but what makes it different is that these are not as much coordinated efforts. These are just the state running out of ideas, and weapons and force is pretty much the only thing they have.
Interesting. So on the other side, how coordinated is the protest? I think.
How coordinated?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things, of course, if there's an uprising, maybe is like to infiltrate the leadership, right?
Yeah.
Is there leadership, or is it?
Yeah. There's been no active leadership from the start. This is also very much a lesson learned from Hong Kong's past protest movement, which also failed partly because the protest leaders, would be seen as turning against the movement, or would be very easy targets for police. So people today organize themselves in loose groups, mostly on online forums, on Telegram groups, increasingly also in other encrypted chat apps and Twitter, where people debate ideas, debate strategies, discuss the legitimization of their own use of force, but also coordinate and simply publicize their own protests or their own strategies, or simply educate each other on how to avoid surveillance or how to build Molotov cocktails.
Good point. What kind of people are on the streets? Because I think in the media it's also portrayed as a student protest, but are there also other people?
It very much depends also on what kind of protests you go to. Past Sunday, about 800,000 people were protesting in the streets. It was a peaceful march. This one was a march that was sanctioned by the government. And in a march like that, you have a very, very general cut through society. Of course, young people are represented very well, but you also see, business people, you see families, you see the elderly, you see people coming out in wheelchairs, people coming out in crutches, people, in their work uniforms. It's very much all walks of life. When you go to some of the smaller protests, the ones that are seen as more radical because of their direct confrontations with police, then they do tend to be relatively young protesters, and the people giving sort of acting as a supply network, including first aid, is then often split between elderly, meaning people over 60, and people who are very young. There's not so many 30, 40, 50-year-olds in the crowds when it comes to active confrontations.
There was a meme circulating, and there was like a protest in the US basically, where people were demanding some communist reform, and then Hong Kong protesters demanding freedom and liberty, really. And I can confirm that from German perspective. In Germany, we have students and young people protesting on a regular basis. The so-called Black Bloc, or the Antifa.
Yeah.
But they demand more communists. So I think it's a bit different in Hong Kong. How well aware are the people there of the history, of the historic details, and what is the strategy?
Yeah. So what is very different in Hong Kong is that there are pretty much no tools to really voice your grievances or to really participate in governance other than going to the street. So it has been like this for a long time, even under British colonial rule. There wasn't much ability to participate in local government. So whenever people wanted to take part in it, whenever people had grievances, whenever people did feel suppressed, they could only really voice that in the streets. In Europe or the United States, you have so many other options of engaging in politics, and most of these options are far more effective, right? Starting an election campaign, or starting a petition, or going to a town hall meeting, or starting like an online campaign, can be far more effective in changing the behavior and changing the actions of your government than a simple protest on the street. especially if you consider how much energy it takes for people to show up at the same spot at the same time and then face tear gas, right? And then having to face injury. So people really don't have any other options. And this is the one thing that they have left. And so that's why we don't see a lot of like mass protest movements in Europe or the United States.
So maybe in short, again, like, what is it from your perspective that you really love about Hong Kong that's worth preserving, and how do you see
So in a way, it is also very much about the people here, right? And they shouldn't have to like give up their identity. They shouldn't have to move away to not be beaten by police. So these people very much are born here, they grew up here, and that's just their city, right? And they want to have a say in how the city is being developed. For maybe the international community, I think Hong Kong is very much an important point because it is the first place where the Communist Party lays out its ideology and its strategy, and pretty much its core interests. And how the Communist Party behaves in Hong Kong will very much define, maybe already in a year or two, in how they behave in Taiwan. And this will also then lay out in how they behave in the communities, in the Chinese communities in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, and in Southeast Asia, and will eventually spread to how to their vision of the future world order. And if they cannot respect Hong Kong's way of life, and if they cannot tolerate Hong Kongers voicing some very basic opinions, then they will also not tolerate these things in Europe or the United States.
Yeah, great insight. So we still haven't touched Bitcoin, but maybe one last question before. So personally, do you think this tension will go further towards the direction of, maybe the protests will be um, kept down, and the laws will come from China, and also we see this tendency all over the world that it's kind of like a fight between ever more powerful governments, ever more centralization, but then due to the economic it's not possible, right, to rule centrally millions of people. It will always end in hunger. So on the other side, people are also like, they have more technology, they have more knowledge maybe. So freedom also seems to have quite a good position. Where do you personally see the world moving? Maybe.
Um, I'm actually quite optimistic about the world. I'm also quite optimistic about individuals being able to retain their sovereignty, being able to fight for their rights. Bitcoin and the internet are massive parts of this. Also in Hong Kong, and also in the challenges that the party faces. I don't think the party or nation states in general are very strong right now. And I think the way they act and the way they have to like openly use their force is very much a sign of their weakness, and it's very much a sign of how they aren't able to convince humans, their citizens, their subjects, of their way of thinking. And the only way they're going to be able to win this in Hong Kong, but all over the world, is with brute force. The only able they're going to convince these people in Hong Kong that their way of life is somehow superior to how Hong Kong has been functioning for decades, is by simply beating everybody and forcing them to flee who doesn't share these opinions. And of course, that's a very frightening prospect, because if they can win this by force, then they will immediately turn their attention to all the other problems that they have, both internally and externally, including in Taiwan and in Pacific Ocean, and they will also try to solve them with force. But history has very much showed us that this doesn't work for very long. This barely works in the short run, and that's why I don't think they have much of a chance, especially with things like Bitcoin, where people are able to much more much more freely decide over their finances and have much an easier time to protect themselves against being forcibly pushed into buying war bonds, which is why something like World War I or World War II is relatively unlikely to happen, despite all these aggression that we are facing from governments. And the Communist Party is very much facing a couple of dozen internal issues, many of which also stem from the fact that you cannot easily create value when all you have is brute force. Or you can of course, the growth that China has been seeing in the past decades is stunning, but it is only really stunning on paper. If you consider how much these people have been suffering under the same regime over the decades prior, were far, far more devastating than anything you would have been used to in the socialist regimes in South America or in Eastern Europe, Central Asia. Because in China, people really were dying by the millions because they were hungry. They were really beating each other up in some kind of ideological civil wars. And of course, if you look at this bottom, then growing 10% per year for a decade or two is entirely possible. But still today, people in China end up with an average annual income of maybe $9,000 per year. And that is very difficult now to sustain, because if we want them to have an annual income of $40,000 per day, then these people will also need to produce $40,000 per year in value. And they're not going to be able to do this if somebody has to tell them what to do and what to say and what to think, and if half of the courses of action they're taking are illegal. A lot of what we've been surprised with and how the Chinese state functions in the last few years is how much their censorship regime and how much their rather brutal police regime also extends to protecting business interests. And this is not so much just protecting business interests internationally, where you might think, yes, sure, the Chinese military is employing spies to extract trade secrets from American and European companies, but even more so that the Chinese police might be going against a Chinese citizen for raising concerns about quality control, right? Where people have been found poisoned by food, and they were unable to voice their concerns. Where journalists have been jailed, not because they were spying on behalf of the United States, but rather because they wanted private CEOs to be held accountable for the deaths that occurred inside of their factories. And we know from basic competition, and we know from the history of Europe and the United States as well, that these people in power will abuse these systems for their personal gain. And that's, again, in an atmosphere, in an environment where you cannot create value, where you cannot compete with the largest telco provider. Because even if you do provide a better service, they are the ones that have the police force attached, and they're the ones who can manipulate courts into suppressing your business.
Yeah, let's move over and discuss a bit more Bitcoin. I remember another picture from France, from the Yellow Vest protests, which also seemed a bit collectivist, a bit dull. But one guy had this buy Bitcoin vest. How aware are people in Hong Kong about the beautiful benefits of?
I think Hong Kongers have heard about Bitcoin for the most part in the 2017 bubble. This has also shaped a bit their opinions of Bitcoin. They do know that it's somehow different, somehow unique, but up until a few months ago, people wouldn't have really seen those unique characteristics as immediate benefits to them. right? In our conversations, of which we have like dozens per week, our meetups for the last years have seen a quite satisfying number of curious Hong Kongers that are asking each other and us questions. But it's never really been obvious of why you want your money to be uncensorable, of why you might be so interested in privacy, right? So a lot of these conversations then occur around, yeah, but what if you want to send some money into a country where the seller might have difficulties getting a bank account? You know, people understand those things, but most people don't make these experiences. And suddenly we have 1 million or 2 or 3 million people in Hong Kong who are actively making the experience that they're afraid to donate something because they do not want their bank account attached to it. They are afraid that if they use their business to sell gas masks or to sell regular masks or black T-shirts, that they're going to be charged with money laundering, or they themselves see that the groups that they see building useful stuff, for example, apps that help you find out, even help you avoid protests if this is like a health concern or this is a concern of yours, unable to conduct their business because they fear they're going to be targeted for this. So we have seen a couple of, especially the Telegram channels that are providing some kind of service to their subscribers to raise money with Bitcoin. We have seen one of the largest sites and services used in the Hong Kong protests, Hong Kong Map Live, which sort of provides you like a live crowdsourced account of where protests are right now, where tear gas has been fired, where police has been spotted, which is used to both evade protesters and evade police. And sites like these have been exclusively funding themselves with cryptocurrency because they have to pay they have millions of impressions per day during a protest, and they find themselves with quite heavy server bills. And they are unable and unwilling to provide their faces because they would be very, very easy targets otherwise. And so they've had the problem that Bitcoin is really the only thing that works for them, but to convince their subscribers and their supporters to give them something of value, they first have to teach them how to use Bitcoin and how to buy Bitcoin. And that's, I think, a situation that is that comes quite sudden, that very much highlights like what Bitcoin really is good for. But at the same time, we don't yet see a run on Bitcoin ATMs, or we don't yet see like a significant uptick in Bitcoin donations. We do see mainly the value proposition just becoming like just completely obvious to everybody, where you don't even have to explain much of what Bitcoin really does. You only have to explain how well it does certain things.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think Bitcoin doesn't need marketing or anything, right? It's just the use case there.
Yeah.
Here
And
in Europe,
please.
Yeah, in Europe, many journalists or people believe, Bitcoin is, just used for drugs and money laundering, and they don't at all grasp these extremely positive aspects. So maybe as a final statement from you, what can we learn from Hong Kong? What else would you like to share? And where do you see the future of Bitcoin?
I think what we should all learn from Hong Kong is that even a couple of individuals can very, very effectively stand up to some of the most powerful regimes in the world, just by leveraging what they can do really well, like acting fluidly, right? Be water, by communicating with each other, and by leveraging anonymity, by leveraging simply crowd knowledge, and for example, there are a couple of groups in Hong Kong that are crowdsourcing some kind of information. And these groups have so many eyes on the ground. I believe their intelligence value matches those from the largest nation states by far. And if you combine that with like a political will of standing up for yourself, even if it's not protests, even if it's just online campaigns, even if it's just educating each other, even if it's just slowly grinding up the machine, then it's incredible how powerful the people can be. And the Communist Party of China, in the 70 years that the People's Republic of China has existed, the Communist Party has never seen a challenge like this. Even Tiananmen Square, even the Cultural Revolution, none of these things have been so much challenges to their rule as this has been, and it's still ongoing. I think that's mainly what we should take away from Hong Kong. Yeah.
Thank you. Where can people follow you, and how can they support you? And I say thank you very much for you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm on Twitter at LeoAW. The Bitcoin Association is also on Twitter. We mainly show news, and we amplify voices from Hong Kong that talk and write and see Bitcoin. So that's at bitcoin.org.hk. That's also a website, bitcoin.org.hk. And if you do come to Hong Kong, then please say hi. We have plenty of events. Just find us. If there's no event, write us. We'll set something up. The community here is very, very alive, very colorful, and they'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and best wishes.
Thank you.